If you looked at our wedding photos, you'd think I was the luckiest woman alive. The way Victor held me like I was the most precious thing in the world, his smile, sharp and polished, made everyone believe in fairy tales that day. But fairy tales don't mention that sometimes the prince builds you a castle just to lock you inside. My name is Isabel Granger, and for 10 years I played the role of the perfect wife in a life that wasn't mine. Victor was everything society admired. A high-profile attorney in Boston, always impeccably dressed, always knowing the right thing to say at charity galas and courtroom steps. People loved him, judges respected him, neighbors envied me for being Mrs. Granger. I used to envy her too, the version of me that existed only in their eyes. At first I believed him when he said quitting my job was for us, that stepping away from teaching would give us time to start a family, to build a home. I told myself it was love when he suggested merging our bank accounts or when he insisted I didn't need to see old friends who never understood our lifestyle. Love, I thought, looked like protection, but protection started to feel a lot like possession. It was subtle the way freedom disappeared. My phone would accidentally reset, deleting contacts. My favorite cafe suddenly became unsafe because of a recent robbery he'd read about. Even the books I loved began to vanish from the shelves, replaced by self-help guides about mindfulness and obedience disguised as wellness. I remember the first time I questioned him out loud. It was over something small, a package I never ordered arriving at the house. Inside was a set of journals, all blank except for a note in Victor's handwriting. For when your thoughts get too loud. I laughed it off, but when I asked how he knew I needed them, his eyes darkened just enough for me to notice. "You've been forgetful lately," he said smoothly, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear. "It's important to keep track of what's real, darling." That night I started writing, not because I believed him, but because something inside me whispered that I needed proof of myself. Weeks turned into months, and the house began to feel less like a home and more like a beautifully decorated prison. Every decision was filtered through Victor. What I wore, what I ate, when I could leave. He masked it all with concern, with phrases like, "I'm just looking out for you," and "You know how fragile you can be." The word fragile became his favorite weapon. One afternoon, I found a file left open on his laptop. Victor never left anything unsecured. It was either a mistake or a message. Inside were audio clips, short recordings of me around the house. Some were normal humming while cooking, talking to myself while cleaning, but others, they were edited, chopped, and rearranged to sound like I was rambling nonsense, laughing at nothing, even crying without cause. My stomach dropped as I realized what I was hearing wasn't just invasion, it was preparation. I confronted him that evening, heart pounding so loud I could barely hear my own words. Victor didn't deny it. Instead, he sighed like a father disappointed in a child. "Isabel, this is exactly what I was worried about," he said calmly, pouring himself a glass of wine. "You're becoming paranoid, hearing things, imagining threats where there are none." He slid a business card across the table toward me. "Dr. Leonard Hayes, psychiatrist. I've already scheduled an appointment for you, just to talk." For your own good that night, I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, realizing that every escape route I thought I had was already sealed. My bank account joint. He monitored every transaction, my car registered in his name with a GPS tracker. I once thought was for safety, even my family distant after years of Victor's subtle wedges driven between us. But I wasn't crazy, I knew that much. The next morning I played along, I smiled, I thanked him for caring. I went to the appointment knowing full well that whatever I said could and would be used against me. Dr. Hayes was exactly the kind of man Victor would trust, clinical, detached, and just empathetic enough to make you lower your guard. For weeks I attended sessions answering carefully, never too emotional, never too calm. But no matter how controlled I was, I could see it in his notes. The narrative was already written. Patient displays signs of anxiety, potential delusional thoughts regarding husband's intentions. The trap was tightening. Then came the day I found two men at my door. They weren't police, but they had badges. Private mental health transport, they called it. A wellness hold, they said, ordered by Dr. Hayes after Victor expressed grave concerns for my safety. Victor stood behind them, a picture of sorrowful duty. "It's just for evaluation, Issa," he murmured, as if this was the hardest decision of his life. "You'll thank me later." I didn't scream. I didn't fight. Because deep down I knew that's exactly what they wanted to brand me. Hysterical. As they led me away, I caught a glimpse of myself in the hallway mirror. I didn't look broken. I looked awake. And in that moment, I made a silent promise not just to survive whatever came next, but to turn this cage he built into his own personal prison. Because Victor thought he was taking away my freedom, he had no idea I was about to take his. The first thing that hit me wasn't fear, it was the smell. A sterile mix of bleach and something metallic like old pennies left too long in the rain. The door behind me clicked shut with a finality I felt in my bones. No windows, just pale green walls and the soft hum of fluorescent lights that never turned off. They called it temporary observation. I called it what it was, a sentence without a trial. The staff at Redwood Psychiatric Facility spoke in tones so gentle it felt insulting, like every word was designed to soothe a child moments away from a tantrum. I learned quickly that silence was my only weapon. The other patients. Some stared blankly at nothing. Others paced like caged animals. But all of us shared the same look, the look of people whose voices no longer mattered. On my second day, they handed me a tiny paper cup with 2 pills. I asked what they were. "Just something to help you relax, Mrs. Granger." The nurse chirped, her smile too wide to be sincere. Refuse and they'd mark me as non-compliant. Accept and I'd lose pieces of myself. I pretended to swallow, letting the pills dissolve bitterly under my tongue before spitting them into the sink when no one watched. But I knew I couldn't play that game forever. Days blurred together, measured only by meal trays and mandatory group sessions where everyone spoke in circles, too afraid or too broken to say anything real. I listened, I observed, and I waited. It was on the 5th day that I noticed her. May younger than the other staff, her uniform slightly too big, as if she hadn't grown into the role yet. But it was her eyes that caught me, not pitying, not patronizing, curious. While the others treated me like a ticking time bomb, May treated me like a puzzle she wanted to solve. "You don't belong here," she whispered one afternoon, slipping me an extra packet of sugar with my tea. I didn't answer, not yet. Trust was a currency I couldn't afford to spend recklessly, but over the next week, May found small ways to show me she wasn't like the rest. A knowing glance when Dr. Hayes visited for his rounds, acting like the benevolent savior. An extra blanket when the nights felt colder than they should. And most importantly, a question no one else dared to ask. What did he do to you? Not what's wrong with you, but what did he do? That was the moment I knew I wasn't entirely alone. Late one night during her rounds, May slipped into my room, glancing over her shoulder before pulling out a folded piece of paper from her pocket. "I wasn't supposed to see this," she said, her voice barely audible over the hum of the lights. "But your file, it doesn't add up." I unfolded the paper. It was a copy of my intake notes. Words like delusional episodes, paranoia, emotional instability jumped out at me. But what chilled me was the section labeled spouse testimony pages of Victor's carefully crafted lies, painting me as a danger to myself, obsessed with conspiracies against her marriage. "He's good," May muttered, shaking her head. "Too good. It's like he wrote a script and everyone here's just following it." I clenched the paper, feeling the weight of Victor's manipulation pressing down harder than the padded walls ever could. "Can you help me?" I asked, my voice steady. Despite the storm inside, May hesitated, fear flickering across her face. "If they catch me, I lose everything." I met her gaze, letting every ounce of determination I had left show. "If you don't, I lose me." For a moment, the silence between us felt louder than any scream. Then, with a resigned sigh, May nodded. "I'll see what I can find." Over the next few days, May became my lifeline. She smuggled in fragments of information records showing payments from Victor to Dr. Hayes labeled as consulting fees, timestamps that didn't match up, and whispers about other patients whose stories sounded eerily similar to mine. But information wasn't enough. I needed proof, real proof. One evening, during a mandatory session with Dr. Hayes, I noticed his recorder, a sleek device he used to document progress. As he droned on about my resistance to treatment, I played my part perfectly. "You're right, doctor," I murmured, eyes downcast. "Sometimes I do wonder if Victor's just trying to protect me." He smiled like a predator sensing weakness. "Exactly, Isabel. Acceptance is the first step." I leaned in, slightly lowering my voice. "But sometimes I think he's hiding something, like those payments you've been getting." "I mean, why else would my husband need to pay my doctor so much?" His smile faltered just for a second, but it was enough. When the session ended, I caught May in the hallway. "He records everything," I whispered. "Get that recorder, there's bound to be something on there." May paled. "That's locked in his office, I don't have access." "Then find someone who does." The next 48 hours were agonizing. Every time a staff member passed by, I wondered if May had been caught. But on the 3rd night, she slipped me a small flash drive during dinner. Her hand trembling as she did. "I couldn't get much," she whispered. "But this might be enough." Back in my room, hidden beneath my blanket, I stared at the drive like it was a key to the outside world. I didn't know yet what was on it, but I knew one thing. Victor's perfect plan had a crack, and I was going to tear it wide open. As I lay awake that night listening to the distant sound of doors locking for the evening, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks, hope faint and fragile but alive. When the doors of Redwood finally opened for me, I didn't step out as a free woman. I stepped out as a marked one. Victor was waiting, of course. Leaning against his sleek black car, dressed in a tailored suit, like he was picking up a dry cleaning order. Not his wife, who'd just spent 3 months in a psychiatric ward. His smile was practiced perfection, the same one that charmed judges and reporters. "Feeling better, darling?" he asked, his voice dripping with false warmth as he opened the passenger door. I slid in without a word. Let him think I was broken. Let him believe his plan had worked, because the Isabel he tried to destroy was gone. And the woman sitting beside him now wasn't interested in survival. She was interested in justice. The first days back home were suffocating. Victor hovered like a vulture, watching for any sign of instability he could use to tighten his grip. My phone was returned, but wiped clean. My emails empty. Every corner of the house reminded me that nothing here belonged to me, not even the walls. But what Victor didn't know was that tucked deep inside my coat pocket was May's final gift before I left Redwood. The flash drive, I hadn't heard what was on it yet, but just feeling its weight was enough to steady me. I waited until Victor left for work. He still believed I was too fragile to leave the house alone. The moment his car disappeared down the street, I powered up an old laptop I'd hidden in the back of a closet years ago, one he didn't know existed. With shaking hands, I plugged in the drive. The recordings were grainy, but clear enough. Dr. Hayes' voice filled the room, smug and condescending. "She's almost convinced now. Another few weeks and we can finalize the documentation. Her husband will transfer the remaining balance once she's fully committed." There it was. Proof that I hadn't imagined the conspiracy. Proof that Victor paid to have me silenced. But one recording wouldn't be enough to bring him down. Victor was too careful, too connected. I needed more. I needed a case airtight enough to not just expose him, but to ensure he could never walk free again. So I became a ghost in my own home. While Victor paraded me around to friends showing off his brave wife's recovery, I listened. I smiled when needed, nodded at the right moments, all while memorizing every careless word he let slip after a glass too many of wine. I found the burner phone he kept hidden in his office drawer used for calls he didn't want traced. I photographed financial statements showing large, unexplained withdrawals, matching the payments May uncovered. I planted a recording device just like he once did to me behind the bookshelf where he took his private calls, and I wasn't working alone. May connected me with the private investigator named Ethan Cole, a former cop turned fixer for people like me. People chewed up by systems designed to protect the powerful. Ethan didn't ask pitying questions. He just reviewed the evidence I had and gave a single nod. "We'll get him," he said simply. Weeks turned into a meticulous routine. By day, I played the dutiful wife. By night, I funneled every piece of data to Ethan Bank Transfer's phone records. Even Victor's emails, once I cracked his password, a variation of his own name, of course. Narcissists were predictable like that. It was in those emails that I found the most damning thread. A conversation between Victor and Dr. Hayes discussing other women, other wives. I wasn't his first victim. There were at least 3 others. One committed suicide, another disappeared into a long-term facility. The third, her name was Rachel DuPont. I tracked Rachel down through sheer persistence and a little help from Ethan. She was living under a new name in a small town in Maine, a shell of the woman she used to be. When I showed up at her door, she almost slammed it shut until I said Victor's name. Her eyes filled with something I recognized all too well. Fear laced with fury over cups of bitter coffee in her dimly lit kitchen. Rachel told me her story. It was mine, almost detail for detail. The same manipulation, the same doctor, the same ending, except she escaped before they could erase her completely. I tried to fight back once she whispered, her hands trembling. "But no one believed me," he said. "I was unstable and they all nodded along." I reached across the table, placing the flash drive in front of her. "They'll believe us now." Rachel agreed to testify if I could guarantee protection. Ethan assured her that once we had enough, we'd bring in someone who couldn't be bought or silenced. Enter Diane Rosenthal, a fierce civil rights attorney with a reputation for taking down men exactly like Victor. When I met Diane, she didn't offer sympathy, she offered strategy. "You've built a strong case," she said, flipping through the thick folder I handed her. But men like your husband, they don't fall unless you push them off a cliff. I smiled for the first time in weeks, a real smile. Then let's make sure he doesn't see the edge coming. By the end of the month, we had everything: financial trails, recorded confessions, multiple victims willing to speak, and a timeline that painted Victor not as a concerned husband, but as a predator exploiting the legal and medical systems for control. All that was left was timing. Victor still kissed me on the cheek every morning before leaving for work, blissfully unaware that each kiss brought him closer to ruin, and I simply waited. Because revenge wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. Sometimes the sweetest revenge was silence right before the fall. The irony wasn't lost on me. Victor had built his entire career inside courtrooms, confident that justice was a weapon he could wield, not face. But on the morning of his reckoning, as he adjusted his cufflinks and kissed me goodbye like any other day, he had no idea he was walking straight into a trap of his own making. At exactly 9:00 a.m., Victor Granger was served. Standing tall in the marble lobby of his prestigious law firm, he accepted the thick envelope with a smirk, likely assuming it was just another lawsuit from a desperate opponent. But as his eyes scanned the first few pages, that smirk faded into something I'd waited months to see. Confusion followed by dawning terror. Charges: unlawful imprisonment, fraud, conspiracy, abuse of psychiatric authority, witness tampering, and attached a subpoena to appear in court within 48 hours. When he stormed through our front door that evening, his mask of control was shattered. For the first time, Victor looked small. "You think you're clever," he hissed, slamming the papers onto the dining table. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." I met his glare with a calmness that only fueled his rage. "On the contrary," I said softly, "I know exactly who I married." Victor paced like a caged animal, ranting about countersuits, defamation, how his contacts would make this disappear. But every name he mentioned was already aware or already too afraid to interfere. Diane had seen to that. 2 days later, the courtroom buzzed with a tension thicker than any trial Victor had ever presided over. Reporters filled the gallery, drawn by whispers that one of Boston's star attorneys was about to be exposed. Victor arrived flanked by his legal team, wearing the same confidence he wore to every battle. But confidence couldn't hide the sweat forming at his temples when Diane and I walked in, followed by Rachel DuPont and 2 other women who bore the same invisible scars I did. The prosecution began methodically laying out the evidence piece by piece, financial records showing consistent payments to Dr. Hayes funneled through shell accounts. Audio recordings of Victor discussing removing obstacles, his term for wives who no longer fit his image. Testimonies from Rachel and the others, each detailing the identical pattern of manipulation, isolation, and psychiatric entrapment. Victor's lawyer objected, deflected, tried to paint us as unstable women conspiring against a successful man. But the mountain of proof was too high, too damning. Then came the final blow. Diane stood holding a sealed envelope. "For the record," she announced, "we submit this letter written by the late Emily Carter, a former victim of Mr. Granger and Dr. Hayes." This letter was recovered posthumously and verified by handwriting experts. The judge nodded, allowing it into evidence. As the letter was read aloud, the courtroom fell silent. Emily's words detailed her descent, how Victor had orchestrated her commitment, how Dr. Hayes ensured she'd never leave. Her final sentence echoed through the chamber. "If anyone ever reads this, know that Victor Granger doesn't just ruin lives, he erases them." Victor's face drained of color. For once, words failed him. The judge's gavel struck like thunder. Bail is denied. The defendant will be remanded into custody pending trial. Victor barely had time to react before 2 officers cuffed him, his protests drowned out by the flurry of cameras and murmurs of vindication. As he was led away, our eyes met one last time. There was no hatred in my gaze, no satisfaction, only closure, because this wasn't revenge driven by spite, it was justice long overdue. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, microphones thrust toward me. Questions flew. How did I expose him? How long had this been happening? Was I afraid? I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of months of silence lift. "I was never crazy," I said firmly, voice steady. "But he will be when he realizes the walls closing in on him are real this time." Diane placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder as we walked away, leaving the chaos behind. Victor had built cages for women like me, quiet cages invisible to the world. Now he would spend years inside one made of concrete and steel, and I was finally free. Freedom didn't come with fireworks or grand applause. It came quietly, like the first deep breath after being underwater for too long. It had been 6 months since Victor's sentencing, 12 years in federal prison. No chance of early release. Dr. Hayes faced his own fate, stripped of his license and awaiting trial for medical malpractice and conspiracy. But for me, true freedom wasn't marked by their downfall. It was the moment I stepped onto a stage holding a simple hardcover book with two numbers embossed in gold, 214. The number of the room where I'd been locked away, the place where Victor thought he'd erased me. Now it was the title of my story, one I refused to let end in silence. When I first shared my idea with Diane and Ethan, they warned me. Going public meant opening old wounds, facing scrutiny, reliving the trauma. But I knew this wasn't just my story anymore. It belonged to every woman who'd been gaslit into questioning her own reality. Every person who'd been told that obedience was sanity. So I wrote page after page. Not just about Victor, but about survival, about reclaiming a voice I never should have lost. To my surprise, Room 214 became more than a book. It became a movement. Support groups formed. Survivors reached out, not just women, but anyone who had been trapped by someone else's narrative. News outlets stopped calling me the victim and started calling me an advocate, but amidst the interviews, book signings, and speaking engagements, there was one place I returned to every week, the small community center downtown, where I hosted free workshops titled Rewriting Your Story. It was there, sitting in a circle of mismatched chairs, that I found real purpose. One evening, as the group wrapped up, a young woman approached me, nervous, clutching a worn notebook. "I read your book," she stammered. "It's the first time I felt like someone understood." I smiled, recognizing the fear and hope tangled in her eyes. "May I asked, gesturing to her notebook. She hesitated, then handed it over. On the first page, in shaky handwriting, were the words, "He said I was imagining it, but I know what I felt." I closed the notebook gently, meeting her gaze. "You're not imagining anything," I said softly, "and you're not alone." As she walked away, I felt a familiar warmth beside me. May, no longer a timid intern, but now a certified counselor, grinned as she watched the room clear out. "Never thought we'd end up here, huh?" she teased. I laughed, a genuine sound that felt foreign not so long ago. Neither did Victor. We stepped outside into the crisp evening air. The city lights flickered alive with stories yet to be told. I thought about Victor sometimes, not with anger, but with a strange sense of detachment. Last I heard, he'd tried to appeal. The court denied him without hesitation. In prison, his reputation meant nothing. His words, once so powerful, now fell on indifferent ears. And me, I no longer lived in that grand house filled with invisible chains. I sold it, the proceeds donated to organizations fighting abuse and legal manipulation. My new home was modest, but every corner was mine, every decision mine. As I walked through my front door that night, I passed by a framed photo on the entryway table. It wasn't of Victor or even of my past life. It was a picture from my first book launch, me, May, Diane. Ethan and Rachel standing together, smiling, not because we had won, but because we had survived. Beside it sat a plaque gifted to me by Diane. It read, "For the woman who turned a cage into a platform." I placed my keys down, breathing in the quiet, not the suffocating silence I once knew, but a peaceful kind, the kind that comes when no one is watching, no one is controlling, just being. Before heading to bed, I opened my laptop to check emails. Among the usual messages was one that made me pause. Subject: speaking invitation, Women's Justice Conference, 2026 message. "We would be honored if you'd share your story and inspire others to reclaim their freedom." I smiled, fingers hovering over the keyboard before typing my response. "I'd be happy to. After all, every story deserves to be told, especially the ones they tried to silence." As I hit send, I glanced at the clock, 2:14 a.m. I chuckled at the coincidence, shaking my head. Some numbers never leave you, but they don't have to define you. Not anymore. Because Victor may have sent me to a psychiatric ward, but I took his freedom and I found mine.